Well, we begin today taking a close look at the role of informants in the FBI. And we'll start by highlighting the case of a man that played a critical role in the Black Panther movement in the 1960s. His name is Richard Aoki, the man you see here. He was a militant activist and armed the Black Panthers. Turns out he was also an FBI informant. This is all recently coming to light after an investigation by Seth Rosenfeld, a journalist that put in a Freedom of Information request to the FBI, asking that they release thousands of documents in connection with Aoki. Here is part of the report from the Center for Investigative Reporting. It discusses the FBI's techniques in dealing with the Black Panthers.
The goal of the FBI was to, first of all, neutralize them.
Techniques ranged from sending false letters or planting negative news stories to trying to foment violence between the Panthers and other groups. The FBI also used informants as part of its COINTELPRO operation.
Well, Aoki committed suicide at his Berkeley home in 2009, but today, many questions remain. To what extent did the FBI know Aoki was arming the Black Panthers? Was the FBI creating violent situations as a way to justify battling the group? This can be compared to the FBI's recent controversial use of informants with activist groups. Take the Cleveland Five, for example, the 5 men you see here. The FBI arrested these men for an alleged conspiracy to blow up a bridge in Cleveland, but some believe it's the FBI that infiltrated the group and encouraged the suspects to carry out the terror plot. Well, it's a slippery slope between the FBI catching criminals and creating them. To discuss this, Trevor Aronson, the author of The Terror Factory, joins us now. Trevor, welcome to the show. So to what extent are informants used in the FBI today?
So as part of the book, I looked at 500 terrorism prosecutions since 9/11, and what I found is that an informant was used in half of those cases. You know, in some cases, an informant is used in the way you might suspect. He simply provides information. But in a lot of cases, actually an increasing number of cases, the informant takes on a role like what you saw Aoki do, where he provides the means and the opportunity for people to commit crimes, for people to commit acts of terrorism.
Now, as exemplified by the case of Aoki, this is not a new tactic by the FBI, but would you say post 9/11 that it is more common?
What's revealing about the Aoki case is that it goes back that far. The general belief was that this happened largely, that started with drug enforcement in the 1980s, and we've seen an increasing use of sting operations since 9/11, where they've basically taken a tactic that was used in the 80s to find someone who wanted to buy or sell drugs, and then flipped it around, and instead of drugs, it's weapons of mass destruction, it's some kind of terrorist plot. And so now more and more the FBI is using this as a counterterrorism tactic. But what they say is that this is a way of identifying today the terrorists of tomorrow. But a real question exists about whether any of these people could have committed acts of terrorism on their own were it not for the FBI providing the means and the opportunity for them to do that.
Now, I know in your book there, you zero in on a few examples. What do you think are the most significant examples of the FBI using informants to create criminals in a way?
There's a good example of this out of Illinois with a man named Derek Sharif. And Derek was down on his luck. His car was broken down. He worked at a video game store. He had absolutely no money whatsoever. An informant came up to him, suggested a plot to bomb a shopping mall in Illinois. Derek got behind that. He was interested in violence, but he had no capacity for violence on his own. It turned out that the FBI, to further the plot, needed Derek to be able to purchase grenades from an FBI agent who was posing as an arms dealer. But what turned out to be the case was that Derek didn't have any money to buy their grenades, so they brokered a deal where Derek would give a pair of old stereo speakers in exchange for grenades. And a plot like that is patently ridiculous because obviously no real arms dealer is going to take old stereo speakers for black market weapons. But that's an example of how the FBI was able to build a terrorism conspiracy charge around someone who really had no capacity to commit terrorism on their own.
Now, that's just one of many examples, but Trevor, would you say for the most part, I mean, is the FBI creating enemies, or are the enemies already there and the FBI is just, trying to bring it to light?
What the FBI would say is that these people who are caught in terrorism sting operations would have become terrorists on their own if given the opportunity by an actual terrorist. If the terrorists were there to say, hey, here's a bomb, do you want to plant this in a shopping mall or in a public square? But the truth of the matter is that there isn't any evidence to support the idea that there are actually terrorists providing these weapons to wannabe terrorists in the United States. So I think we can conclude then that without that, the FBI has become very effective at creating the very enemies it's hunting.
So are you saying that it hasn't proven to be an effective method of stopping crimes or acts of terror?
When you look at actual terrorists, such as Najib al-Zazi, who came very close to bombing the New York City subway system, or Faisal Shahzad, who tried to plant a car bomb in Times Square, these were men that informants never tipped the FBI off to, and yet they got very close to actually committing acts of terrorism. The people that FBI informants are finding and uncovering are people who are interested in violence, are odious for whatever reason, but they have no capacity on their own to commit this violence, and yet the FBI informant is able to provide that violence, the means for them to commit violence. And so I don't think there's any reason to believe that the people swept up in FBI sting operations would have on their own been able to commit the terrorist acts they were ultimately allowed to commit through the use of an FBI informant.
Okay, so it's questionable just how effective this tactic really is. Why do you think the FBI resorts to this, using informants in this way so often?
Part of this is a bureaucratic problem. Every year the FBI receives $3 billion from Congress earmarked for counterterrorism. It's the largest part of the FBI budget. And the FBI can't really come back to Congress and say, hey, we looked around, we didn't find any terrorists. There's so much pressure on FBI agents to bring terrorism cases that the use of informants has become widespread. And I think there are cases where, were it not for the pressure, the FBI could sit back and say, this guy is just a loudmouth and he's talking big, but he's never going to be able to do anything with his talk. Instead, they're pursuing those cases. Instead, they're going to those people who are talking big and saying, we can provide you with this bomb. And that's what they're doing. And it allows, the FBI to increase the number of terrorism cases. When FBI Director Mueller has testified before Congress, he specifically mentioned these sting operations, specifically mentioned as terrorists, people who were, for example, a stalker at Walmart who had no capacity on their own to commit terrorism.
Now, in the end, Trevor, what do you think this is doing, in terms of public sentiment? Is it creating this sense of paranoia, to be paranoid of these radical groups?
Well, I think the FBI wants to create a situation where, someone who is interested in violence wouldn't commit it because they fear that the person they're working with is an informant. But it has another effect, and one of those effects is that, for example, in the Muslim community where you've seen so many of these sting operations, there's a mistrust of the FBI. There's an unwillingness to, cooperate and volunteer information to the FBI. I suspect the same is true of, eco-terrorists, and certainly similar things have happened. Like you mentioned, the Cleveland group, for example. That was an example of a group that had no capacity on their own to commit violence. Yet someone, an FBI informant, provided them with a bomb to blow up a bridge. But without that FBI informant providing the bomb, there was no way that group of 5 men could have committed the conspiracy they were charged with.
Now, presumably, there are instances where this tactic of using informants has been effective, you can presume, because they continue to use it. But it does bring up this question: where do you draw the line between preventing and provoking criminal activity?
I think that's a question that the FBI is really struggling to answer. In general, when these cases have gone to trial, the evidence tends to be so overwhelming, plots of bombing a bridge or a public transit system, that juries have been unwilling to be sympathetic to entrapment defense. So as a result, the FBI has a clear message from the judiciary that it's okay to pursue these types of cases. And as a result of that, I think we're seeing an explosion of these types of sting operations that are centered primarily in Muslim communities related to counterterrorism, but also affect left-wing groups and eco-terrorist groups, such as the Cleveland Five you mentioned.
All right, Trevor, very interesting stuff. That was Trevor Aronson, the author of the book, The Terror Factory.
Thank you.